So thanks to all of you for joining in the discussion today. We haven't yet got back to our in-person meetings this year, although we did a few last year. We had a very successful annual dinner with 800 people, but times have got more difficult again due to the health department restrictions. At any rate, it's great to have Miranda Devine on the line from New York. Now, she's very well known to all of you, I guess, because of her columns in the Daily Telegraph, but I'll introduce her briefly. And I'm using the introduction, the note in her new book, or in a book by Simon & Schuster, Laptop from Hell, which is about Biden Jr. So Miranda Devine is New York Post columnist and a Fox News contributor. She also works for the Australian media as a Daily Telegraph columnist and, of course, as a Sky News contributor. She was born in Queens, New York. She grew up in Tokyo and Sydney and attended Northwestern University in Chicago. She describes herself as a reformed mathematician and currently lives in New York, writing for the New York Post and the Daily Telegraph. So we're very grateful, Anne and I and the team, Lolita and the team here, are all very grateful you're doing this for us. So Miranda Devine is going to start off talking for about 15 minutes, and then we'll come to questions and discussion, and we'll finish no later than 12:30 our time, or 8:30 New York time. So Miranda Devine, on the topic of an update on President Joe Biden and United States politics. Thank you.
Thanks, Gerard and Anne, and lovely to be with you and be sort of back in Sydney, at least in spirit right now, from snowy New York. So Joe Biden, I guess it's no great insight to tell you that he hasn't been doing terribly well. His first year as president could be chalked up to something of a disaster, and the polls reflect that. We had a Quinnipiac poll a few weeks ago that had his approval down at 33%, and markedly he is failing with independents. And I think he had 25% of independents. Hispanics, who comprise 22% of the population, he's down to about 28%. So he's really underwater, and he's underwater on all the issues that are important. I mean, inflation, obviously, the economy, illegal migration, his foreign affairs capabilities, and even on COVID, which was his sort of calling card. Really, I guess the reason he won the election. He promised two things. He was going to unite the country as a moderate, and he was going to beat the virus. And he's done neither. In fact, he's been incredibly divisive, quite deliberately so. From his inauguration speech on January 20, he really maligned half the country. I mean, the 75 million people who voted for Donald Trump, he basically pigeonholed them as white supremacists and domestic terrorists. And, that was an interpretation that I certainly put on that speech, and so did many other conservatives. But since then, he's been even more explicit. He gave a speech in Georgia a couple of weeks ago, ostensibly about this voting rights legislation that the Democrats are trying to push through Congress. And he just defined anyone who opposed it, which includes members of his own party, people like Joe Manchin, the senator from West Virginia. Basically said that they were nothing better than slaveholders and equivalent of Bull Connor and white supremacists and basically racists. So this has been a curious way of winning hearts and minds, and it obviously from the polls hasn't been working. And the polls started to crash for him last August when with that botched Afghanistan pullout. Americans wanted the war to end, and Donald Trump had been the one to begin the process. So it wasn't that anyone wanted it to keep on going. It was just the sheer debacle that we saw unfolding in front of our eyes I mean, it was Joe Biden's sole decision to abandon Bagram Air Base, which was the heart of the problem, and millions of dollars of equipment and military equipment and helicopters and planes and weapons, so he showed incompetence in that entire saga, but also callousness, which again belied the sort of mythology that he's created around himself, that he's this deeply empathetic man, because of his own private tragedies, his tragedies in his personal life, which have defined his political career from its very beginning. And I mean, probably the best example of the callousness was when the bodies of 13 young military members were brought back to Dover Air Base in his home state of Delaware for this, really touching ceremony that Americans do, which is called the dignified transfer. It's not really a ceremony. It's just this very silent procession of the coffins being brought out and transferred to vans. And the president typically goes there to the tarmac and stands with the families and salutes. And so Joe Biden was there alongside these parents of these young men and women, and he kept on glancing at his watch over and over. It was terrible. It wasn't caught on camera, but this was something that the parents commented on very bitterly afterwards. So that that sort of redefined the sort of person he was, and also his lack of concern for the American citizens and the Afghan allies who were left behind in Afghanistan, and the lies he told about that. So that there was a huge disillusionment that occurred over that episode. And then after that, I guess his character kept on being redefined away from that, honest Joe Biden myth that he'd always had. And then, of course, I mean, the economy, it's always a big deal. And inflation, which is the worst in 40 years here. And, at first, the Biden administration denied that it was happening. Then they said it was, transitory. And then, even just recently when Joe Biden gave his first press conference in, I think it was 78 days, which didn't go very well. He was trying to sort of gaslight people and tell them, no, there's no such, it's not true that the supermarket shelves or that the store shelves are empty. I mean, that's not true. And he was also trying to say that, things aren't really that expensive. That's also not true. I mean, petrol itself has gone up by almost 40% since he was elected. I mean, obviously that's not entirely his fault, but he the first thing he did when he came into office, or one of the first things he did on that first day, was sign an executive order to basically stop this XL pipeline bringing gas down, petrol fuel down from Canada, and he's sort of banned fracking on federal lands. America was energy independent, and because of the sort of green pressures and green virtue signaling, that's sort of gone by the wayside. And, groceries and, their supply chain problems. Inflation, you have to say, the primary cause of it is the federal government just continuing to pour trillions of dollars in unnecessary stimulus into the economy and, adding fuel to the fire. So that is being hung around his neck. And then there's the border crisis. 2 million illegal migrants came over the southern border last year. That's the ones we know of. There are others that are called gotaways, which, could number, I don't know, anything in the 500,000 number, no one really knows, as well as huge quantities of fentanyl, for instance, enough to kill. The Border Patrol last week said that they had seized enough fentanyl coming across the border to kill every man, woman, and child in the country, and that's just what they found. So those 2 million illegal migrants that have come across the border from dozens of countries. I mean, they're not just South American, Latin American, Central American countries. We're having people from the Middle East, from Yemen, from, Africa. So the word has got out that that Joe Biden has laid out the welcome mat, and he absolutely has, and he hasn't. The administration is really doing nothing to plug the gaps. The Border Patrol are completely demoralised. In the last week, there's been leaked video of conversations with Alexander Mayorkas, who's the head of the Department of Homeland Security, and also the head of the Border Patrol, trying to have meetings with their sort of frontline troops. And they're, one border agent turned his back on Mayorkas. The Border Patrol boss had a really vigorous arguments with a lot of his troops, who one of them said to him, evil happens when good men do nothing. And that's what's happening right now, because the situation is now, the border is so porous that they're releasing illegal migrants who have criminal records. So that and they're not testing them for COVID. And what they're doing to prevent the crisis becoming a big media event is they're not detaining them and then not leaving them in those border towns. They're actually putting them on buses and planes and flying them secretly in the middle of night around to other parts of the country, including Westchester, about an hour out of New York City, very quiet suburban community, the White Plains Airport, which has a curfew from midnight to 6 a.m. They were flying these plane loads of illegal migrants into that airport, and the New York Post broke that. I went up there with a photographer for a few nights last year and photographed and recorded these flights as they came in, and the people were bussed to, dropped off on the New Jersey Turnpike at a rest stop and bussed out to orphanages and things. So, former orphanages. And so the illegal migration, which the administration is trying to deny as a problem, is really just avoiding the issue, is trickling through the population as a real problem. And then there's law and order, which is slightly connected. You have all these Democrat cities where the homicide rates have gone through the roof. And this is all stemming from two things. One is the rise of these so-called progressive prosecutors, these district attorneys in so-called blue cities, Democrat cities, who have basically rewritten the law. I mean, they've dismantled offences. We in Manhattan have a new district attorney called Alvin Bragg, and the first thing he did was issue a memo saying, all these crimes would no longer be prosecuted, or they'd be downgraded from felonies to misdemeanors, including armed robbery. If no one's hurt, well, that's not an armed robbery. So this creates a sort of revolving door situation where the cops are arresting people and then they're coming out the next day. And then on top of that, you have, in New York, this happened all over. The state legislators in Albany, actually a year ago, but it was sort of covered by the pandemic, they did a whole lot of criminal justice reforms, including bail reforms, so that people don't have to pay bail to get out after they've been arrested. So that's led to a lot of recidivist, violent criminals on the street. And then on top of that, you've had the police all over the country, but I see it particularly with the NYPD. They've been handcuffed because after the George Floyd riots last May, which continued on through the summer, and which were weaponized by the Democrats to create this sort of feeling of chaos as a prelude to the election campaign. Those riots, the police were, defunded. Democrats were behind that defund the police, progressive Democrats, that defund the police campaign in New York. $1 billion was stripped from the NYPD. And And basically a whole lot of other pressures were put on police. So they really just sit around watching while shoplifters go and clean out, the drugstores just up the road from me. So crimes are not being policed, not being prosecuted. And so the homicide rate has gone through the roof in many of these cities. And Joe Biden is sort of bearing some of the blame for that, and Democrats are. And so he's coming to New York this week to talk to the new mayor, Eric Adams, who's a former cop, and try and sort of put his imprimatur on getting on top of crime problems, this crime wave. And he's saying, oh, I put a whole lot of money into my stimulus package that you can use for the police and spend more money, which is hilarious considering that during the campaign, Joe Biden was playing footsies, let's say, with the defund the police movement. He said, he was asked in one interview, do you think that we should be diverting money from the police into, like social workers and so on? He said, oh, absolutely, we should be doing that. So that's all going on. And now, at the same time, Biden's cognitive health is not good. That's obvious to anyone who sees it. Politico had a poll recently which showed that a majority of Americans have concerns about Biden's mental fitness. And so this is talked about a lot because anytime he gives any sort of a speech or a sort of media opportunity, which doesn't happen that much, he's behind a teleprompter or he has notes that he reads from. He seems unable to string a sentence together without relying on somebody having written the words for him. And so that's a problem. And it's, he'll be 80 years old in November. And but it's something that was evident during the election campaign. I mean, I was in Iowa and New Hampshire during the primaries in early 2020, and you could see then that he was not terribly sharp, didn't have much energy. There was no real momentum in his campaign. I think he came 4th in Iowa and 5th in New Hampshire, or the other way around, but very bad showing. And he was the only candidate who would have to bring a teleprompter into these tiny little town hall meetings. We're just giving a stump speech. So, it's been a politician since he was 29 years old. And you'd think he could manage a stump speech, but he wasn't able to. And you could see from the sort of lackluster crowds that he was pulling compared to, say, the Pete Buttigieg's and the Amy Klobuchar's, and certainly compared to Bernie Sanders, who had Trump-like enthusiasm, especially from young people wherever he went. He was filling enormous stadiums. And Joe Biden was struggling to fill, a tiny little movie theater in Manchester, New Hampshire. So that was all obvious, and whatever funny deals that happened in South Carolina, thanks to Jim Clyburn, who's a sort of an eminent Black senator down there with a lot of following. That won Joe Biden the Black vote, and that got him the nomination. And then he spent the entire campaign. I mean, we joke and we talk about hiding in his basement, but effectively that's what he did. And he just allowed Donald Trump and the pandemic to do its magic. And he hung every COVID death around Donald Trump's neck. That was really the main attack line from the Democrats. But now, Joe Biden has presided over more COVID deaths in America than Donald Trump ever did. And, very arrogantly, the Democrats came into office thinking that the vaccine was some sort of a magic bullet. And really, it turned out not to be. And Joe Biden used to pull out this card from his wallet all the time and read out, the latest death toll number. Well, he stopped doing that now. And you can see in the polls, he's now underwater on COVID as well. And the vaccine mandates, the mask mandates, they're being overturned in the courts, and they weren't popular anyway. So all up, it's been a hell of a year for Joe Biden, and he doesn't show any signs of being able to sort of tack towards the middle where he needs to be. So I think I'll wrap up. I think I've spoken enough. I think I've done 20 minutes there.
Thank you very much, Miranda. So I just should say it's great to have Miranda back. She spoke here once on the English language in a panel discussion we had, and once on the book on Frank Devine, the late Frank Devine, Miranda's father. And Frank was a great friend of the Sydney Institute of Anne and myself, and that was an important publication. So I'm just going to, talking about publications, we'll go to questions and discussion in a minute, but I just thought I should lead off in relation to your book on Hunter Biden, which I mentioned in the introduction. Hunter, Laptop from Hell, Hunter Biden, Big Tech, and the Dirty Secrets the President Tried to Hide, which has had quite an impact in the United States, as someone who watches a bit of American television knows. So just tell us briefly a little bit about the book. It's going very well. I think it's not available in Australia yet. There are distribution problems with all books all over the world, but it will be here soon. But just give us a brief note about why that book created such interest in the United States.
Thanks, Gerard. I think the book will be available either this week or next week in Australia, the hardcover. Look, I guess the story of Hunter Biden's laptop came to the public last October, about 3 weeks before the election, when the New York Post ran the first of a series of stories about emails contained in the laptop that put the lie to Joe Biden's continual claim during the campaign that he knew nothing about his son Hunter Biden's overseas business dealings. So Hunter Biden, his son, is, I think he's 52 now. He had a raging crack addiction, also a porn and prostitute addiction. He had a problem hanging on to his laptops. The laptop that we got hold of was one of 3 that I know of that he's left behind, lost, has been stolen. Now, this laptop he dropped off at a MacBook repair shop in Delaware back in April of 2019, a few days before his father actually announced his candidacy for president. And he never came back to claim that laptop, and that became the property, therefore, of the owner of the repair shop. He eventually gave it to the FBI and gave a copy to Rudy Giuliani, which is how I came to get a copy of it, and the Post, the rest is history. Now, as soon as we published that first story, which was written by my colleague Emma Jo Morris, the big tech, I mean, we kept that offline until 5 a.m. And immediately Twitter and Facebook within hours had blocked it and censored us. Twitter, in fact, locked the New York Post's Twitter account for 2 weeks, right up until the eve of the election. And Facebook said that they were censoring it pending fact checking, which, as far as I know, they still haven't done, because they haven't contacted any of the other email recipients who I've been in contact with to verify whether the emails we published were correct or not. And then at the same time, you had the John Brennan, the former sort of disgraced, I call him, head of the CIA, who was involved in the whole Russia collusion hoax, and 50 of his sort of, former intelligence and defense operatives, people like Leon Panetta, people like Michael Hayden, who you would think would know better, signed a letter claiming that the laptop, and therefore the New York Post stories, had all the hallmarks of Russian disinformation. I mean, they didn't, and these people had never looked at the laptop. They'd never asked us for a copy of the hard drive. We would have happily shown it to them if they'd wanted to see it. So that letter was used with great effect by Joe Biden in his next debate against Donald Trump. And he claimed that the intelligence community in America had dismissed the laptop and said it was Russian disinformation. Well, it wasn't. And the evidence on the laptop is overwhelming about the corruption that the Biden family has indulged in for 40 years in Delaware, but also they internationalized that influence peddling operation when Joe became vice president. And it's not just the laptop, which is really not quite enough to create this damning indictment. It's also the testimony of one of Hunter Biden's former business partners, Tony Bobulinski, who came out before the election to verify what we had published, and who also handed over the contents of all his devices to the FBI. I also have those contents. That's the other part of the jigsaw puzzle. And another part of the jigsaw puzzle, which I put together in the book, is a very good investigation done by two Republican senators, Chuck Grassley and Ron Johnson, into Hunter Biden corruption and Burisma, which is the name of the corrupt Ukrainian energy company that was paying Hunter $83,000 a month to sit on its board. And the senators there had access to Treasury Department documents, these so-called suspicious activity reports, which track money coming into American bank accounts from suspect sources like Russian oligarchs or Chinese state-owned enterprises, etc. And you put that all together, and this is not a story about Hunter Biden, it's a story about Joe Biden and how he is compromised in basically his dealings with countries like Russia, China, Ukraine. I mean, I could name more, Kazakhstan, Romania, and so on, but countries where his family profited enormously to the tune of tens of millions of dollars, basically using his name to open doors. And Joe Biden was involved in that. He was, getting a cut of the action, at least one of the Chinese joint ventures. He was listed as having 10% reserved for him by Hunter Biden. That was 10% for the big guy, which was the name that Hunter and his partners, one of the names they used to refer to Joe, because they didn't often refer to him by name. Hunter also referred to him as my chairman. Now, this comes not just from the laptop, but from Tony Bobulinski's encrypted messages, which the FBI has and I have, and also from what Tony Bobulinski himself has attested to. And then there's also evidence that I found on the laptop of commingling of Hunter Biden and Joe Biden's finances, shared bank accounts, shared debit cards, also some evidence, not a lot, but a little bit of evidence that Hunter Biden was paying for Joe Biden's bills, for instance, a monthly AT&T phone bill and maintenance on one of his homes in Delaware, painting, replacing shutters, rebuilding a retaining wall, putting in a new air conditioning system in a cottage on the grounds that Joe Biden used to rent out to the Secret Service, a few $1,000s here and there that had to be paid to local contractors. So that's evidence that implicates Joe Biden. And the FBI is doing an investigation, we only found out after the election, into Hunter Biden for allegations of tax evasion, money laundering, and also it's believed some of his foreign dealings. And just yesterday, in fact, I was given a copy of a subpoena that was issued by the US attorney in Delaware, a man called David Weiss. And in May of 2019, just after Joe Biden announced his candidacy and just after Hunter Biden abandoned his laptop at that Delaware repair shop. So this subpoena was for the bank records of Hunter Biden, his uncle Jim Biden, Joe Biden's younger brother, and two of Hunter's business partners, Devon Archer and Eric Schwerin. And it was their bank records from JP Morgan Chase that were being subpoenaed, and any transactions that might have originated with the Bank of China, which is where a lot of the money that flowed into bank accounts associated with the Bidens and their business partners. So that was happening before the election, and that investigation was paused just as the campaign was heating up. That's been publicised by Politico and so on, quite well sourced, that David Weiss decided, and as did Bill Barr, the Attorney General, that these investigations should not become common knowledge because they didn't want them to get embroiled in sort of partisan, election politics, which I suppose is understandable. But I cite some polling that was done by the Media Research Centre after the election, which shows that about half of Biden voters had no idea about these investigations. They had no idea about the scandals that had been uncovered through the laptop, and about 10% of them would have changed their vote had they known. And in an election that was decided by about 45,000 votes in a handful of battleground states, that could have made a material difference.
Paul, let's go, Paul Blankey. Paul?
Okay, great. Thanks, Miranda. America's in two major international negotiation sessions at the moment. One with the Iran and the nuclears with Russia, with the Ukrainian problems. Both seem to be going pretty poorly at the moment. How much would you slate that down to the Biden administration, or how much would you probably put on to the more potent negotiation skills of the other side?
Well, I mean, it's I think pretty obvious that the Biden administration is botching this, and Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, who's a longtime Biden loyalist, is not really performing particularly strongly on the international stage. But I mean, getting back to my book, I think that we see that Joe Biden is compromised with America's adversaries, and they know it. The laptop, and we know that one of those laptops of Hunter Biden was, in his own words, he said was stolen by Russian drug dealers. He was a very indiscreet person and was constantly being put in compromising positions when he traveled to China or Russia or any of these countries, particularly Ukraine. The people that he was allied with in Ukraine were all Russian-aligned people. In fact, the owner of Burisma, a guy called Zlochevsky, had been a minister in the previous Russia-aligned sort of kleptocracy that was ousted during the Maidan Revolution, and they skedaddled, basically stripping the coffers bare, leaving Ukraine completely broke and therefore desperate for American money. And so curious that, when I don't think a lot of people understand that when they hear that the Bidens and Hunter Biden in particular was getting so much money from Ukraine, they don't understand that it was the Russian Ukrainians, the Moscow-aligned Ukrainians. And the other thing is that, Hunter was mixing in these inner sanctum of Vladimir Putin. I mean, there's one scene in the book where he leaves a State Department luncheon in Washington that his father was hosting for Xi Jinping, gets on a plane and flies to Moscow and has breakfast at the home of an oligarch who is a right-hand man of Vladimir Putin. So, and all the people that Hunter, his overseas business partners, very many of them, Joe Biden met. I mean, he invited them to his home in the White House, in Observatory Circle, the vice president's residence in Washington, D.C. when he was vice president. He met with them in 2015 at a dinner that Hunter had organized at a famous Georgetown Italian restaurant called Cafe Milano, in a private room there. And Joe Biden was vice president, and he met Ukrainians, Kazakhstanis, and Russians. He met Mexicans. He met Chinese. Hunter's business partner, one of his business partners in Beijing, when Joe Biden flew Hunter into in 2014 into Beijing for his official meetings that he had there with Xi Jinping and the Communist Party hierarchy. Hunter introduced him to his new business partner, who was just about to make him very wealthy. And Joe went off into a private room and had 10 minutes with him, and who knows what they talked about. And so the problem, you can't really extricate Joe Biden's personal family corruption from America's foreign policy. And that's the problem. I mean, you know, Washington is a corrupt place. I mean, a third world level corruption. And influence peddling is just kind of in the air there. It happens always. Joe Biden was a master at it, and he internationalized it. And when he was vice president, he had carriage for, you know, for China. I mean, this has a huge impact on Australia. At that time, for instance, in 2014, when Joe went to Beijing with Hunter, he was tasked by President Obama with doing something about China's growing aggression, about the militarization of those islands in the South China Sea, about the theft of, you know, intellectual property, and so on. And you know, these issues, which we now know are pretty much out of control, and you know, why Scott Morrison has had to enter into the AUKUS deal. Back then in 2014, were probably you know, America were within America's power to control. But Joe Biden went to Beijing and came away empty-handed. In fact, you know, Xi Jinping went and conducted some flyovers of you know, Japan at the time. So there was sort of open contempt for Biden. But when Hunter Biden got off the plane on that trip, it was obvious to Chinese eyes anyway what was going on. This was American power come to do private business. And it's very understood in China that when you want to bribe a top official, you don't give the money to them, you give it to a family member, and most often to the sons and daughters of these top CCP officials. And there's a name for them, which is princeling. And that's what Hunter Biden is. He was a princeling. So Joe Biden is compromised. And whether or not that really is having a material impact on his decisions when it comes to foreign policy, or, you know, his advice, or what he does with Anthony Blinken, you don't know for sure, but there's certainly the appearance of, you know, really terribly compromising situation that is quite concerning when you layer it on top of just the sheer incompetence.
Thanks. So we're going to give Mark another go. Mark, we didn't get you last time. Then we'll go to April, and then we'll go to Matt, and Ida Lichter's got a question. So we move quickly. Mark, are you there?
Thanks, Gerard, and thanks, Miranda, for your time. You've outlined a very compromised, very incompetent current president. You've written previously about the compromised and incompetent prior president, who calls himself 47 now, I think. What is it about the American system that can produce two so profoundly incompetent individuals as being president, former president, and an aspirant for future presidency?
Well, I don't know that I would call Donald Trump incompetent. I mean, there are a lot of negative things you can say about him, but he actually did a pretty good job as president, and the economy was going swimmingly. You know, he got rid of a lot of red tape that was sort of choking business, and started to tackle the administrative state. And in terms of his foreign policy, I don't see how you can really fault him. So incompetence is not the pejorative that I would use for Donald Trump. But I think the reason that America got Trump, who really you can just describe as a barbarian, is because they had been so let down by the Republican Party. I mean, it's described in Washington as a uni party. When it comes to selling out America's middle class, which was happening a long time before Donald Trump ever decided to get into politics. I mean, Joe Biden was part of that push by the kind of political class to bring China into the World Trade Organization, to outsource manufacturing, and to kill off the heartland. And so that created a real resentment and a real enrichment of one class of American and a real class divide, while the heartland of America was impoverished, jobless, and dying of fentanyl overdoses. So there's a good amount of resentment that grew up in Middle America, and there just seemed to be no politician, no mainstream politician who was willing to tackle what is really a cross-party disease. And so in comes the outsider, and Victor Davis Hanson, who's a terrific writer here, and with I think it's the Claremont Institute and a few other think tanks, he described Donald Trump as kind of like the gunslinger in High Noon, who the townsfolk are just at their wits' end. Law and order is completely broken down, and they hold their noses and call this barbarian in to clean up the town. And he does it, but they're embarrassed by the tactics that he used and by his uncouth behavior, and so they throw him out. And that's kind of Donald Trump. I mean, he is what he is. He was hired by the American people to do a job. He didn't really manage to do it as well as he should have because of his own flaws. Chief among them being really terrible at hiring people. I mean, he just didn't do a good job, and also betraying people that were loyal to him. And I would say chiefly Mike Pence, the vice president. So that's that. When it comes to Joe Biden, I think it's a deep problem with the Democratic Party, which really, I mean, we don't hear much about this, but there's really an internal war going on there, which I think will afflict all left of centre parties, including Labor Party. And between the sort of the progressive fringe and what used to be the sort of moderate middle roaders, James Carville was sort of railing about this the other day, the great sort of Clinton Democratic advisor, and he points out that only about 7% or 6%, I think, of Americans are actually progressive, who believe in defund the police, open borders, empty the jails. And in the Democratic Party, it's probably about 11 or 12%. So they're the smallest part of the Democratic Party, but they make the most noise. They make, 3/4 of the noise. And that's because, I think, at least mostly because progressives also dominate the newsrooms. They dominate academia. They dominate big tech. All the sort of power structures of the establishment in America are dominated by progressives. And so that sort of has weakened the political immune system in America. That's how James Carville describes it. And so you have this situation where Donald Trump had turned a lot of people off, a lot of the sort of suburban mums, for instance. And Joe Biden presented himself as the moderate unifier, which is all people wanted, and someone who took COVID seriously and was going to keep them safe. That was all a lie. He wasn't any of those things. You just have to, I know from having just investigated his past, I mean, it's all on the record. He's a plagiarizer, a serial liar, a teller of tall tales. really delusional in a lot of ways, and not a nice guy. I mean, we see it now. He gets angry and shouts and yells at people and maligns his opponents and has very thin skin, but he's always been like that. It's not just that he's slipping cognitively, it's just that he's in the hot seat and we're seeing who he is. But I think a big part of the problem is the media and the establishment media, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the news that you're getting in America is mainly coming from those sources. So you're getting a very distorted view of both the Trump administration and the Biden administration. But in America, I think that people are just seeing with their own eyes, they're feeling their own hip pocket. They're seeing how the mythology of Joe Biden, the image of Joe Biden, and the reality that they're seeing are so at odds that they've been so-called red-pilled. You see that in Virginia in November, where Glenn Youngkin, a sort of a mild-mannered Republican, conservative Republican, won office. He's a multimillionaire, former private equity guy, father of 4, but he's not he's not extreme right. He's not Trumpian at all, and he won this upset victory. I mean, absolutely shocking everyone. Virginia, the sort of dormitory state of Washington, D.C. And he won it mainly because of the mums and dads vote. And, these during the pandemic, where there was a lot of remote learning, parents, I guess, paid more attention to what their children were being taught and were horrified by the sort of ideological propaganda that was being pumped into their kids in lieu of actual learning, critical race theory, gender fluid stuff, what we call in Australia safe schools, and they started going to their school board meetings, which is a sort of a democratic way that I don't think exists really in Australia, but Americans get involved in trying to alter the curriculum or stop egregious things from happening, and they were causing a real stink, and this was being ignored by the Democrats. In fact, the White House, basically the Attorney General, sicked the FBI onto these mums and dads. So Glenn Youngkin tapped into this angst with these suburban, I guess moderate, a lot of them would have been Democrat voters, or certainly Biden voters, Obama voters. And they were so disillusioned by Joe Biden, so distraught about what was happening to their kids, the masking all day and so on. And he talked about parental rights. He talked about freedom. He talked about family, just basic conservative values, not about anything extreme, but not using the sort of rhetoric of Trump. But that really gave the Democrats a bit of a scare. So maybe the pendulum swung one way with Trump and it swung another way with Biden. Maybe it'll come back into the center. But I wouldn't make the mistake of sort of judging America as some sort of crazy clown show, circus country. It's a very serious country with very serious people engaging in debates. And I have found that what's happening in politics here ends up in Australia at some point. And so I guess maybe Australia has some protection with the sort of parliamentary system where you can get rid of your prime minister, but I think we did a bit too much of that in recent years. Yeah, I mean, under the surface, there are currents that are happening that are being contested and fought against. And that looks ugly, but it's better than not contesting them.
Okay, we've got 10 minutes left and we've got people on the call. Got to move very quickly. So Matt, you're still there, Matt?
Do you expect the cumulative effect of the Trump and Biden presidencies will be a greater desire amongst Americans for a unifying leader, or do you think it'll be the further entrenching of bitter partisanship? Thanks.
Look, I think Americans are desperate for a unifying leader. I think it appalls most of them, the vicious partisanship that has happened. And it's not just about politics. I mean, COVID has really pitted neighbour against neighbour. the sort of differing views about restrictions. And so I think there's nothing that they would like more. But by the same token, I don't think Republican voters have the appetite anymore for what they call rhinos, Republican in name only. I mean, the Mitt Romneys, so on, who are, or even the Lindsey Grahams and the Mitch McConnells. Although Mitch McConnell, I think, gets a bit of a rough deal. But anyway, the Republicans who kind of mouth platitudes and say they're going to reach across the aisle while their own constituents are being undermined and impoverished and diminished and maligned. So that sort of slow death, the controlled opposition, I don't think that they are going to go with that anymore, because the Republican voter is different from what we traditionally thought of as the Republican voter. It's the, I think Jim Jordan, who's a congressman, Republican congressman, described it to me once as, it's now the party of beer and blue jeans. It's not champagne and caviar. It's that a lot of the former Democrat voters, the blue dog Democrat voters, have come over to the Republican Party, which really is the only party that's representing the middle class. The Democrats are basically the very uber wealthy elites and the very poor, the underclass, and that's why they're going to such efforts to mobilise the vote, to have mail-in voting and drop boxes and so on, to try and maximise the vote from those people who traditionally don't vote very often, because it's not compulsory here. So I just don't see that somebody who's a smooth talking Mitt Romney type is ever going to win the election in 2024. It's more likely to be a Trump, or better yet, a Trump person without the rough edges. So a Ron DeSantis, for instance, the Florida governor, who is every bit as tough, as canny, as switched on about the incursions of the left as Donald Trump is, but he's also very methodical. His language, while strong, is not intemperate, and he doesn't, he doesn't do mean tweets, I guess. So he might be more palatable to those Virginia mums who voted against Donald Trump, but voted for Glenn Youngkin. The thing is, the country has really fallen so sharply since Joe Biden got in, and the polls have plummeted so much. Rasmussen, which is more of a conservative-leaning poll, had for the last month Donald Trump vote at the same time, polling at the same time, had to be higher than Joe Biden's. So I think that as time goes on, and with Trump having been deplatformed, so you're not hearing as much from him, people's animosity towards him may be blunted somewhat. And also the fact that they were just hoodwinked by the Democratic Party into voting for Joe Biden, who was not at all what he pretended to be.
We've got time for two very quick answers and two very quick responses. So I'm going to go with Anne and Sophie. So Anne? Can't hear you.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi. Miranda, it's great to have you on. We had Annalise Nielsen do a Zoom for us late last year, one of your Australian expat colleagues, and she was impressed by the fact that the American media is much more robust and comes out slanging, the different opinions are clear and focused, and people can make up their own minds. And it's clear from what you're saying, media's got a big influence over the way people see what's actually happening. And in many cases, they don't have a clue what's happening because a lot of the media censors what they don't want people to hear. So how have you found working in the American media? What's your take on it?
Yeah, thanks, Anne. Thanks for having me. Yeah, and Annalise is fantastic. She's, of course, doing her news for Sky News. Look, I would say that American media is robust and everyone is incredibly articulate, but there's a real divide. Half the country just doesn't see anything conservative. Half the country is consuming New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, MSNBC, the main networks. And they, for instance, they ignored the Hunter Biden laptop story. They were running stories about Joe Biden, about, what ice cream flavors he liked, how great he was at laying logs in the fireplace in the White House, all about, his dogs. And the latest one is his new cat. Even the dogs didn't work for him because one of them was constantly biting the Secret Service agents, had to be sent away. So, despite an absolutely sycophantic left-wing, I wouldn't even call them left-wing. It's the establishment media. It's the prestige brands that most Australians read and see. That despite that glowing coverage from them, his polls have still plummeted. And I think it's just because people can see for themselves in their own hip pocket. But I also think that conservatives have no choice but to be bombarded with left-wing talking points. We know their worldview, but they don't know ours. So it makes them weak. It makes them have very thin skin, very stressed and anxious when something intrudes on their version of reality that they don't like. It makes them intolerant to opposing point of views, and it also has weakened them because they are unable to debate opposing views. The only recourse they have is to silence and shut down the person. You see that with the latest Joe Rogan controversy. So I don't necessarily agree with the premise that there's a lot of debate and conversation. There used to be, but it's now the country is divided and one side is not talking to the other side.
And a brief question, Sophie.
Miranda, thank you very much, and thanks, Gerard and Anne, for hosting.
Hi, Sophie.
Miranda, we miss you.
Miss you
we
too.
miss your determination to deliver the truth to all of us. Look, I had two very quick ones. The first is, do you have a forecast for any future Republican candidate for the presidency? DeSantis, you've mentioned, maybe Mike Pompeo, even Trump himself. And secondly, will you have any spare capacity to do any media work in the lead up to our federal election this year?
Thanks, Sophie. Look, I'm actually coming back to Australia whenever the election is called to cover the campaign for a few weeks for the Daily Telegraph. So that'll be fun. I really enjoy it, and so I'll be interested to get your take on how Scott Morrison is doing. From this angle, he looks to me like he's really getting an unfair trot. I don't understand. I wrote a column today saying you don't know how good you have it. Honestly, you compare him to Joe Biden. I saw him when he came here to Washington last year for the AUKUS talks. He was very, very good and, very strong, very focused, and everything was about Australia's national interest. The comparison with Joe Biden couldn't be further from that. So I just say, be careful what you vote, what you wish for. But anyway, I'll come back and see for myself. And as for, look, you've named the three top people. While Donald Trump hasn't announced his candidacy, everybody around him is basically saying he's going to do it. He keeps on dropping these hints for some financial reason. He can't really announce it yet. And then Mike Pompeo is the dark horse, former Secretary of State. I think if America were in a really parlous state, on the brink of war or whatever, by 2024, Mike Pompeo would come to the fore because he, former military man, top of his class at West Point, somewhat safe, steady pair of hands there, brilliant, knows everything about, did a great job of foreign policy. He was really Trump's, steel fist when it came to China and Russia and so on. He has no illusions about China. And then Ron DeSantis, he's young, he's vigorous, he's done brilliantly in Florida. He's a Harvard grad, young wife who's just recovered from cancer, young kids, photogenic, incredibly articulate. And you just look at the way he handled the pandemic from first principles. I mean, he gathered experts together and ascertained very early on that it mostly hit the elderly. And so he quarantined and kept safe the huge percentage of elderly. A lot of retirees go to Florida. It's got one of the highest elderly demographic in the country, and he kept them safe. And he's also provided, monoclonal antibodies where the Biden administration has been banning them, or worse still, in New York, they've been filtering, only allowing Black people and minorities or their favored identity groups to get these treatments. So Ron DeSantis is someone, and in polls, he shows up as number one if Trump isn't in the picture. And look, I just think it depends how the country is faring by then. I mean, how much more damage Joe Biden can do in the next 3 years. The midterms in November will change things a lot because the Republicans look to regain the House and the Senate. If they do that, Joe Biden's effectively a lame duck. And they will start doing investigations into things like the Hunter Biden scandal. I've been told that they'll be using my book as a sort of a blueprint for those investigations. And also, I mean, the southern border, the absolute outrage that's going down there. There's talk of impeaching Joe Biden. I don't know who that helps. And then the elephant in the room, of course, there is his vice president, who's hopeless and even more unpopular than he is. So I don't know. I mean, I think things can change between then and now. But Trump certainly, if he goes for it, which it looks like he will, he's very good at destroying his opposition.
Miranda, thanks for that. Look, we could go all night your time or all day our time. There are many more people who want to get in on the call, but we run to time here. Anne made a point. We had Annalise Nelson before Christmas. Before that, we had Tom Friedman from the New York Times, and today you. Now, that's been a terrific performance. We're very informative. We're very grateful. Look forward to seeing you back in Australia in a couple of months' time. But for today or tonight, many thanks. It was terrific. Well done.
Thanks, Gerard. Thanks, Anne.